The fetid evil swamplands and their human lizards retreated to the east, and Topal and his men's hearts were greatly gladdened by the sight of diamond blue, pure sweet ocean. For 3 days they sailed in great cheer northwest, where first hold beckoned them, but hope died in horror as land like a blocking shield rose before them. Topal the pilot was sore wroth, and consulted he the maps he had faithfully drawn to see whether best to go south where the continent must end, or take the river that snaked through a passage north. North, cried he to his sad men, north we go now. Fear not, north. And so one elf, Topal, or Torval as he is also referred to, would make a mistake, a lapse of judgment that would set forth a chain of events that have since shaped the history of Tamriel as we know it. It is likely that if this elf did not exist, Tamriel would have been discovered by someone else, perhaps other elves, and that cultures would have flourished anyway, but who can really say exactly how it could have happened? The unique cultures that grew to prominence, the empires that rose and fell, the wars, the crises, it all could have been so different. But why? What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Michael and welcome to FudgeMuppet. Tamriel is one of the multiple continents that exist in the Elder Scrolls universe, but it is the only continent that has ever featured in-game within the series. Its massive landmass is home to the overwhelming majority of provinces, factions, cities and races we love and know so well, but it was the wrong decision of one elf that resulted in this continent's early history, and therefore the events that followed after playing out in the way they did. Today I will tell you the story of Topal the Pilot, reading from a translation of his fragmented journal, Father of the Niben, revealing his story, providing insight on the various observations he recorded, and explaining how his actions had a significant impact on the Elder Scrolls timeline. The story is translated into Tamrielic by a man named Florin Jalil. Florin is a Latin name, so perhaps he is an imperial scholar, however we do not know much about him. In Father of the Niben, he not only translates fragments of Topal's journal, but also adds his own commentary, which I will draw from and expand on. Florin starts with an introduction explaining that there is only one written record of Topal the Pilot's adventure, the earliest known Old Mary explorer of Tamriel. There's just the 4 short verse fragments that remain, however other evidence does exist of Topal's journey. In the Great Crystal Tower of Somerset Isles you can find maps of Topal's voyage. Florin describes them as crude but fascinating, commenting that they are Topal's legacy to all of Tamriel. He also notes that the writings of Topal's journal are controversial, which I will also explain in this video. We will also discover that Topal's legacy is so much more than drawn maps and sea navigation. In Florin's translation, he does admit that he has strived for simple coherence, and goes as far as saying that other scholars might disagree with his word choice. He makes no promises that it lives up to the beauty of the original, but I think for people such as ourselves, those trying to piece together the deep lore of the Elder Scrolls universe, this simplicity is probably best. But firstly, before we dive into Fragment 1 of the journal, let's firstly understand the time and the setting. Topal the Pilot's story takes place in the Merethic era. He was an Oldmer, one of the ancient elves who came from their lost continent of Oldmeris. The Oldmer, that's with a D not a T as opposed to Altmer, which are high elves, eventually splintered off into other groups. The Oldmer are the original race of elves on Nirn who claim to be descendants of Aedra, and they have since vanished as a race sometime in the Merethic era, as they eventually turned into the other elven races we study and play today. However, it is generally accepted that the High Elves of the Somerset Isles are the most similar to the Oldmer. They're considered Oldmer who stayed the most true to their original form, as opposed to those other Oldmer who travelled out to other provinces of Tamriel, eventually changing into the other elf races. So legend has it that the Oldmer came to the Somerset Isles in the early Merethic era, after their original continent that they lived on, Oldmeris, faced some sort of crisis. This forced them to search through the seas for a new place to live, and tales say these Oldmer refugees were lost in a storm until finally arriving in the Somerset Isles. It was here the Oldmer society began anew, creating a civilization on the Somerset Isles during a time where Daedra and Aedra still roamed freely. Eventually, however, Oldmer navigators, including Topal the Pilot, would venture out in various directions to see what they would discover. Some people believe they were simply searching for new frontiers to discover what existed nearby outside the Somerset Isles. However, in the journal fragments, it is suggested that Topal and the other navigators were in fact searching for the homeland that they came from, Old Maris. In Topal's journal, Florin explains that this continent is referred to as Old Elnathe. However, as students of Elder Scrolls lore, you might know that the Elnathe are a group of Etarda, divine beings and original spirits, who decided not to abandon Mundus in the Dawn era, and instead remained in the mortal realm, populating it. It is suggested that because the Elnathe were associated with the land of Old Maris itself, it was given the name Old Elnathe in addition. Now let's dive into the first fragment and see what we can gather from it. Second ship, the Pasquiniel, manned by pilot Ilio, was to follow the southern pointing waystone, and the third, the Niben, manned by pilot Topal, was to follow the northeast pointing waystone. The orders from the Crystal Tower, they were to sail forth for 80 moons and then return to Tel. Only Niben returned to Firsthold, laden high with gold and spice and fur and strange creatures, dead and live. Though alas, old Elnathe Topal never found, he told the tales of the lands he had visited to the wonderment of all. For 66 days and nights he sailed over crashing waves of dire intent, past whirlpools, through mist that burned like fire, until he reached the mouth of a great bay, and he landed on a sun-kissed meadow of gentle dells. As he and his men rested, there came a fearsome howl, and hideous orcs streamed forth from the murky glen, cannibal teeth glotted with gore. Just a quick note, we must remember that these are Oldma and not men as the translation calls them. However, it is easy to understand what Florin means to say. These men are Topal's Old Mary crew. So the first thing we hear of are the ships involved in the journey. The fragment starts by talking about the second ship and then mentions the third ship is named the Niben and is manned by Topal himself. You will likely recognize the word Niben from Cyrodiil's Niben Bay, which is actually named after Topal the pilot's ship, as he was the first to discover it. There's also the Niben River and the Nibene Basin, but not too far from here there's also Topal Bay, again clearly named after Topal the pilot. So fragment 1 mentions the second ship and the third, so it's safe to assume that there is also a first ship whose name has been lost to time. The ships had orders from Crystal Tower to sail forth for 80 moons and then return to the Somerset Isles, but only Topal's ship, the Niben, made it back. The fate of the other two ships is unknown. However, we can guess what might have happened based on the waystones each ship was using. But what are these waystones? Well, as the translator Florin explains, the Oldma actually navigated using strange crystalline balls, many of which have been dug up at the sites of ancient Old Mary docks and shipwrecks. These special balls were baffling to the archaeologists that first picked them up, until they eventually figured out that each one would rotate in a specific direction on its axis. Scholars aren't 100% sure how they work, but it seems that they are attuned to some sort of lines of power. Florin believes there are 3 varieties of these waystones, those that point southward, those that point northwest, and those that point northeast. In fragment 1, we hear that Topal the pilot was sent with a northeastern pointing waystone, and that the second ship, the Pasquiniel, was made to follow the south pointing one. We can only assume that if the leaders at Crystal Tower who sent the ships were trying to explore as much as possible, that the first unnamed ship was sent with the northwestern pointing waystone. While these waystones are mystical and a neat bit of lore to learn about, I can't help but think about them from a practical perspective that multiple directions would not be needed. I'm no navigation expert, but if a ship was sent with a waystone pointing south or north, the captain should be able to use this direction to figure out the directions of the other waystones, and at that, just all other directions in general. Still, the waystones are definitely a cool artifact and obviously were nevertheless a very useful tool for early Oldman navigators. If the first ship was in fact sent northwest, it would have been towards the direction of Yakuda and Thras, where it may have perished at the hands of ancient Slode, in the case of Thras, or the Yakudans, if it reached Yakuda. The ship could have also been taken down by a mighty storm, who really knows for sure. All we know is that it did not return. The same goes for the second ship, which was sent south. Florin believes that there's a chance that this ship, the Pasquiniel, met an ill fate at the violent hands of the ancient Payandaneans, also known as the Marimar or the Sea Elves. These Sea Sea Elves are said to have been created from the Oldma, but were exiled to Pyandania long before the Pasquiniel could have arrived there. It is said that during the time of Aldmeris, before the Oldma departed the continent, that there was a very rich Oldma nobleman named Orgnum. He tried to rebel against the government of Aldmeris with a large group of followers who failed and were then exiled to Pyandania. The Oldma then used magical powers to create a veil of mist around the island continent in an attempt to trap the exiles there. Eventually, these exiled Oldma would become the Sea Elves, a relentless elven race with insectoid ships and sea serpent mounts. There are many theories as to how the Oldma arrived at the Somerset Isles, but the main theory about Aldmeris facing a crisis and the Oldma being lost in a storm until finally discovering the Isles seems to make sense here. Think about it. The Oldma have completely lost their bearings. If they're searching for their homeland, like the translated fragment suggests, then needing to try 3 different directions, none of which succeed, with 2 ships likely perishing, one perhaps at the hands of a violent race the Oldma themselves created long ago by exiling them, then the Oldma really aren't too sure where the Somerset Isles are in relation to where they originally came from. As Florin puts it, what other explanation is there for 3 ships heading in 3 opposite directions to find a place? However, Florin goes on to say that unless the Oldma are idiotic, that one of the ships must have been pointing in the right way, and it may have been Topal and that he simply might not have gone northeast far enough. However, if we want to play a guessing game, I would assume that Aldmeris would have been positioned somewhere to the south. It makes sense that it would be somewhere closer to Pyandania, where the Sea Elves were exiled to, and we already know that to the west of Tamriel is Yakuta, and to the east is Akavir, and to the north is Atmora. Anyways, in Fragment 1 we learn that Topal the pilot, who sailed northeast, found the mainland of Tamriel. In his commentary on the translation, Florin says that Topal the pilot sailed in a straight line, northeast through the Abyssinian Sea and into the Iliac Bay, before touching ground somewhere near Anticlair after 2 months. This is an area on the southern coast of High Rock in the Iliac Bay region. I agree that Topal the pilot did in fact go to High Rock, as the fragment describes High Rock's landscape of a sun-kissed meadow of gentle dells, and it's safe to assume that mouth of a great bay is the Iliac Bay. However, what's confusing is Florin's idea that the Iliac Bay is directly northeast from First Hold in the Somerset Isles. If we take a look at a modern map of Tamriel, we can see that it is not. The mouth of Iliac Bay is in fact almost directly north of First Hold, if not ever so slightly northwest. However, if we look at a map of Tamriel back from Elder Scrolls Arena, then it is northeast. And you can pretty much explain all the little discrepancies in direction from Florin by comparing a modern map with the map from Arena, and then it all makes much more sense. Also in Fragment 1, which is one of the largest to unpack by the way, there's the mention of hideous orcs, which streamed forth from the murky glen with cannibal teeth glotted with gore. There's quite some controversy to this, for it is believed that orcs did not exist at this time and were created later from the Aldmeri, who worshipped the ancient Aldmeri deity Trinimac, who had an altercation with Boethia and the followers of Veloth. You see, Topal the pilot ends up sailing all around Tamriel, charting the lands and providing the information to the Oldmer of the Somerset Isles that there are more lands out there. History would not have been the same if it were not for Topal the pilot, if he did not chart the lands of Tamriel and return to the Somerset Isles with the knowledge of distant lands such as Morrowind. Then the following waves of Oldma who left the Isles, becoming the Chimera and then the Dark Elves and creating the Orcs in this altercation, and the Oldma who went to Cyrodiil and built the Aelid Empire, it all could have happened so differently. Florin also mentions in his commentary of Fragment 3 that Topal mapped out the inner seas of Morrowind too. But back to the controversy of orcs. If orcs were created after Topal returned, then what orcs did he supposedly meet in High Rock? Well, I can't know the truth for sure, but there's a few theories. Some scholars ponder the idea that orcs were actually an aboriginal tribe predating Aldmeri colonization. Another theory is that the orcs were actually created back in the Dawn era, which is based on a few sources which mention this, so there's a lot of confusion on the topic. One loophole could be that the followers of Trinimac could have been created into something that already existed, orcs. Therefore, some modern orcs could be descendants of Trinimac's followers, followers, while others are descendants of Aboriginal Orc tribes, but overall they might just be the same thing. This is all just speculation. Another idea is that the orcs described in the translation of Topal's journal are not orcs as we know them today at all. This is because Father of the Niben is merely Florin's simple translation of the Old Mary version, Udhendra Nibenu. The word Orzma is the Old Meris word for orc, and the closest translation of the Old Meris language into Tamrielic is meant to be pariah folk. Pariah is more or less just another way of saying outcasts, so perhaps these so-called orcs that Topal encountered were merely just other types of ancient goblin kin that existed in the area. They could have been ogres who, by the way, also worship Malakath. Anyways, the early orcs ended up with a very independent tribal way of life. They went to multiple provinces in Tamriel, forming small villages and strongholds. And the Kaima that also came from that altercation between Trinamak and Boethia, they went to Morrowind and eventually became the Dark Elves. The first fragment had a lot to analyze, but now we can get into the second one. No passage westward could be found in the steely cliffs that jutted up like Giant's Jaw, so the Niben sailed south. As it passed a sandy, forested island that promised sanctuary and peace, the crew cheered in joy. Then exultation turned to terror as a great shadow rose from the trees on leathered wings like an unfurling cape. The great bat lizard was large as the ship, but good pilot Topal merely raised his bow and struck it in its head. As it fell, he asked his bosun, "Do you think it's dead?" And before it struck the white-bearded waves, he shot once more its heart to be certain. And so for another 40 days and 6, the Niben sailed south. It is a shame that more fragments were not recovered because, as you can tell, between the first and second one, Topal the pilot has sailed all the way around to the other side of Tamriel. Here he is trying to sail southwest back to the Somerset Isles, but obviously, as we know today, all of Tamriel's in his way and he is forced to head south along the coast and is going through and around and past Morrowind. Florin, the translator, provides helpful insight here, explaining that the sandy forested island is likely Gorn, a small landmass located off the east coast near Necrom. Gorn is also home to strange creatures found nowhere else, such as the Gorn-striped wolf. However, in the story it appears that Topal fights with some sort of ancestor of a cliff racer. If it was truly as large as the ship, that is very intimidating. It almost sounds like a dragon, however I doubt it. If it were, it's not likely Topal could drop it with one arrow in its head. The steely cliffs are said to match the area around Necrom, which is built on a peninsula overlooking the Patamaic Ocean near Gorn. One thing to appreciate here is the skill set of Topal. Here we learn that Topal the pilot is not only a good storyteller, sailor, and cartographer, but also quite good with a bow. His archery skill might have been exaggerated to make the tale more epic than the reality, but even still, slaying such a large creature is no small feat, whether it took one shot or 20. Florin comments on this fragment, saying that he knows of archaeological proof which suggests the Oldma of the Merethic era were definitely talented archers. He mentions they possessed bows made from layers of wood and horn drawn by silver silk, truly beautiful weaponry and very deadly. Topal then continues to sail south. He travels down the east coast of Morrowind and then down around Blackmarsh, coming around to the area now called the Topal Bay or the Topal Sea. This is water situated between the coasts of Cyrodiil, Blackmarsh, and elsewhere. This part of the voyage and the decision to travel north are in Fragment 3 of Father of the Niben, which I actually narrated as the introduction to this video. I don't have to read it twice, but I will show it on screen so you can get familiar with it again. In this fragment, Topal describes sailing away from the swamps of Blackmarsh, of which he described as evil and filled with, as the translation reads, human lizards. We can easily guess that these are ancient Argonians. Florin believes this swamp to likely be near present-day Gideon, and explains that the crew heads northwest along the coast looking for a way back to Firsthold, but find their ship seemingly blocked by more land. As Florin points out, Topal didn't know that the landmass in his way was only a jutting peninsula and not endless mainland, because if he did, he could have sailed around it and not do what he did, which was head up the river. He only knew he was too far south of Firsthold, and so he turned to his sad crew and told them, "North we go now. Fear not, north." Florin also notes the irony in this decision, for the bay he thought was a never-ending ocean is now known as Topal Bay, and the river that led him astray, the Niben River, has been named after his boat. Personally, I think it's Fragment 4 which is the most significant to Topal's legacy, for here he gains possession of the lands upon which the Imperial City now sits. So let's get into the final fragment. The cat demons of 4 legs and 2 ran the river's length, always keeping the boat in their green-eyed sight, hissing and spitting and roaring with rage. But the sailors never had to brave the shores, for fruit trees welcomed them, dropping their arms down to the river's edge as if to embrace the myrrh, and the men took the fruit quickly before the cats could pounce. For 11 days they traveled north until they came to a crystalline lake and 8 islands of surpassing beauty and peace. Brilliant, flightful creatures of glorious colors greeted them in Old Mary language, making the mer wonder until they understood that they were only calling back the word they were speaking without understanding it, and then the sailors laughed. Topal the pilot was enchanted with the islands and the feathered men who lived there. There the Niben stayed for a moon, and the bird men learned how to speak their own words, and with talent feet to write. In joy for their new knowledge, they made Topal their lord, giving him their islands for the gift. Topal said he would return someday, but first he must find the passage east to Firsthold, so far away. Here there's mention of many fascinating things, one being these cat demons of 4 legs and 2 that constantly chased the ship as it traveled up the river. This is very likely ancient Khajiit, which again is controversial in many ways, namely because it contradicts the Khajiit creation myth. I strongly encourage you to search up our video called Skyrim: How Every Race Was Created, where I explain all of this in deep detail, of which I simply cannot cover to the same extent in a video about Topal the pilot. However, the gist of it is that there are multiple theories on the Khajiit's origin. One is supported by Topal's story, that the Khajiit were once simply indigenous cat-like creatures who were in Tamriel before men and mer arrived. They would owe their survival to their adaptability, which other native creatures, such as these feathered bird people who Topal spoke to, must not have had, as they are now extinct. Imperial scholars believe these Khajiit are descendants of a race of great cats who hail from the desert areas of Nirn and simply survived the influx of men and mer who came into Tamriel. The reason this is controversial is because the Khajiit creation myth says that Azura created the Khajiit from the forest people and bound them to the moons, allowing them to change their shapes to survive. This same myth also says that Ifri was then given the remaining forest people to change into a form of his own, which he did, creating the Wood Elves. The Wood Elves are believed to be descended from Oldmar, who may very well be these forest people, elves who traveled from the Somerset Isles and went to the Valenwood area. The Khajiit are believed by some to be descended from Oldmar as well, and the same creation myth talks about the lands of elsewhere being changed by deities, notably making the deserts hot and the sands biting, the forests wet and filled with poisons. More evidence that the Khajiit have something to do with the Oldmar comes from the story of Pelennor Whitestrake slaughtering hordes and hordes of Khajiit. Apparently, Pelennor was trying to slaughter thousands of elves, not Khajiit. So why did he do it? Well, it is said that he acted by mistake, and his impression were that these Khajiit were another strain of Aldmeri, and that they looked alike. There's also the fact that there are various Khajiit breeds who each have their own look, and some of them look a lot like elves. The Omez Rat are a breed of Khajiit who have skeletal features like men, but short golden fur of very similar color to Ultima skin. Then there's the breed simply called the Omez, who look almost the same as a wood elf. The Khajiit pantheon is also similar to the old Aldmeri pantheon, so perhaps just like the Oldmar, who became the Kaimar and went to Morrowind, and the Oldmar who supposedly turned to orcs, and those who went to High Rock and bred with the Needs, creating Bretons, are the Khajiit perhaps wandering Oldmar who were made into cat people. It's hard to say. However, if Topal's story is to be believed, then the Khajiit were always in Tamriel, far before any Oldmar with knowledge of Topal's journey set off into other parts of the continent. It is also sad to know we'll never know who these feathered bird people were, as Topal's gift to them, the ability to speak and write, was not enough to save them from extinction. Perhaps it was the ancient Khajiiti who hunted them to death. Who can say for sure? These feathered people gave Topal the 8 islands, which later on Oldmar would travel to, becoming the Aelids. These Aelids came here in the Middle Merethic era after Topal the pilot charted the lands, and they settled predominantly in Cyrodiil, free from the strictures of Old Mary culture culture, such as the inability to worship the Daedra. Maybe it was the Aelids who decimated the feathered birdmen that Topal and his elven crew met. These Old Mary travelers who became the Aelids would go on to build a great Aelid empire and even construct the famous White Gold Tower. This is what I mean by Topal's legacy being very significant. Perhaps history would have played out completely differently if he did not acquire these islands from the birdmen by teaching them to speak and write, and most importantly, perhaps the group of Oldmer that traveled here would have gone elsewhere if Topal did not incorrectly travel north up the Niben River from Topal Bay. Think of all the events that sprung from the Aelids, such as the Elysian Slave Rebellion and the Elysian Empire that followed after it. It's fascinating how one decision can spur on so many monumental events in the future. So after meeting the bird people, Topal returns back down the Niben to Topal Bay, discovers his mistake and travels along the coastline past the shores of Valenwood and finally home to the Somerset Isles. As Florence so eloquently puts it, it's quite a history in a few lines of simple verse, all because a man failed to find his home and took all the wrong turns to retrace his steps back. And there you have it, folks, the tale of Topal the Pilot, an early Oldmer explorer who charted Tamriel, and with his knowledge provided the Merethic Oldmer of the Somerset Isles with a vast amount of land to explore and settle in. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you want to read the fragments again along with Florence's commentary, the text is called Father of the Niben and can be found in Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion and Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim. You can also find Fragment 1 and 2 in separate parts in the Elder Scrolls Online. Thank you so much for listening to my insight on the story of Topal, or Torval the Pilot, and I hope you learned something new, or at least came to view this piece of Elder Scrolls lore with a new appreciation for its significance in the Elder Scrolls universe. Social media links are in the description as always, and if you want more lore content like this, be sure to subscribe as we've got loads coming. My name is Michael, thank you again for tuning in, and I look forward to nerding out with you again very soon.